On August the 16th, 1942, two naval officers departed Treasure Island on a routine coastal patrol. By noon, their blimp returned empty. What followed was not a mystery but a record, preserved exactly as it was in 1943. The file contains flight logs, radio transcripts, search reports, and a final administrative conclusion: presumed dead. No additions, no revisions, and no explanation. Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody and Ensign Charles E. Adams disappeared under conditions considered safe aboard an aircraft that made its way back on its own. The Navy searched every location it could reach. When there was nothing left to document, the investigation ended. This is not a story about concealment, but about limits, about what could not be reached, and about the silence that procedure cannot replace. 1 year to issue an administrative determination. 82 years later, the question remains. Ernest Dewitt Cody was born September 22, 1914, in Mayville, Michigan, population 514. The town existed at the intersection of two county roads in Tuscola County, surrounded by farmland that produced sugar beets, corn, and men who understood that reliability mattered more than brilliance. His father, Houston DeKalb Cody, worked in agriculture-related business. His mother, Dora Kerr, managed a household with at least 4 children. The family was neither wealthy nor destitute. They occupied the vast middle of Depression-era rural America where survival required consistency, not risk. Cody attended local schools. Records show regular attendance, no disciplinary issues, grades sufficient for advancement. He was not identified as exceptional. He was identified as present, prepared, and punctual. In an environment where crop failure could devastate a family, those qualities carried weight. Around 1936, when he was 22, Cody wrote home with a clarity that characterized his entire life. "Mother, I think I'll be a sailor." The phrasing is important. Not "I dream of" or "I hope to be." Just, "I think I'll be." A statement of intent, not aspiration. But the path from rural Michigan to the Naval Academy was not direct. Academy appointments were distributed by congressional district, and competition was fierce. Mayville had no particular pull in Lansing or Washington. Cody's chances of securing a direct appointment were minimal, so he chose another route: enlistment. He joined the Navy as an ordinary seaman, learned the actual work of seamanship, and used his enlisted time to prepare for the Academy's preparatory program. The Navy maintained a small quota for enlisted men who demonstrated aptitude and commitment. Cody targeted that opening. His strategy worked. He tested into the Academy's prep class, a grueling year, designed to bring enlisted candidates up to the academic level of direct appointees. Classmates later recalled that Cody studied with the same methodical focus he applied to everything else. No drama, no shortcuts. Just steady accumulation of knowledge. Cody entered the Naval Academy in 1934 as part of the class of 1938. He was assigned to the 12th Company, a detail that meant little beyond administrative convenience, but which would later help identify him in group photographs and yearbook entries. The Academy, in the mid-1930s, was transitioning between eras. The Navy still maintained a significant battleship force, but aviation was expanding. Submarine doctrine was evolving. The institution trained officers for a service that was changing faster than doctrine could capture. Cody's approach remained consistent. He attended classes, stood watches, completed physical training, and logged no disciplinary infractions. His academic performance showed competence across technical subjects without specialization in any particular field. He was not at the top of his class. He was solidly in the middle, which meant he had successfully absorbed 4 years of intensive training without failure. Midshipmen who served with him remembered little that was dramatic. One classmate interviewed decades later offered this assessment: he was steady, didn't waste words. Another recalled that Cody checked equipment more than once before signing off on inspections. A third noted that he kept his personal space organized with near geometric precision. These observations seem minor, but they accumulate into a profile. Cody was not a natural leader who inspired through charisma. He was a natural follower of procedure, who could be trusted to execute orders exactly as written. In a military organization, that quality is valuable. His handwriting appears in preserved documents from this period. Letters to his mother, pages from his personal notebooks, entries in training logs. The script is immediately recognizable: letters, evenly spaced lines, ruler straight, a consistent rightward slant. There are few corrections. When errors occur, they are crossed out with a single line not scribbled over. The aesthetic is not decorative. It is functional. It communicates discipline. Cody graduated in June 1938 and received his commission as an ensign. He was 23 years old. The world was not yet at war, but the Navy was already preparing. New ships were under construction. Training tempo was increasing. The peacetime service Cody had imagined was already becoming something else. Cody's first assignment sent him to the battleship USS Tennessee, one of the Navy's most powerful vessels. The Tennessee displaced over 32,000 tons, carried 12 14-inch guns, and required a crew of more than 1,400 men. It was a floating city with its own hierarchy rhythms and unforgiving standards. Junior officers aboard battleships learned quickly that error had consequences. Mechanical systems were complex and interdependent. Navigation required precision. Gunnery demanded mathematical accuracy. A mistake in one department could cascade through others. The ship punished carelessness without mercy. Cody served in various junior officer rotations, engineering, deck operations, communications. Performance evaluations from this period use consistent language: competent, thorough, reliable. One commanding officer noted that Ensign Cody demonstrates appropriate concern for equipment maintenance and crew safety. That phrase, appropriate concern, is revealing. It suggests that Cody worried about the right things, not about advancement or recognition, but about mechanical reliability and the welfare of the men under his notional supervision. His specific fear, mentioned in multiple contexts, was technical failure that endangered the crew. He checked equipment repeatedly. He followed checklists exactly. He did not trust memory when documentation was available. This attention to procedure served him well. He accumulated sea time without incident. He stood watches without complaint. When more senior officers needed a junior to execute a routine but important task, Cody was often selected not because he was brilliant, but because he could be trusted to do exactly what was required, and nothing more. His personal life during this period showed similar patterns. He wrote home regularly letters that contained updates on duty stations, descriptions of ports visited, observations about weather and ship operations. The letters were not literary. They were informative. They communicated that he was well, that he was performing his duties, and that he intended to continue serving. In May 1940, during a brief shore assignment in Charleston, South Carolina, Ernest Cody married Helen Augusta Haddock. She was 22, born in Pennsylvania, from a family with its own military connections. Her uncle, Ira Frederick Haddock, would later achieve the rank of Rear Admiral. The wedding was small and efficient. No extensive honeymoon. Cody returned to duty shortly afterward, but the marriage marked a change in his correspondence patterns. Where before he wrote home to his mother sporadically, he now wrote to Helen with strict regularity every week, sometimes twice a week, regardless of operational tempo. The letters themselves were not romantic in the conventional sense. He did not compose poetry or express longing. He wrote about what he had done, what he would do next, and when he expected to write again. The relationship manifested through consistency, not eloquence. Helen would later say that she could set her calendar by his letters. They arrived like clockwork. In late 1940, Cody volunteered for aviation training. The decision aligned with Navy requirements. The service was expanding its air arm rapidly, and with his own aptitude for technical operations. He was accepted into lighter-than-air training, a specialization that most aviators considered unglamorous but essential. Lighter-than-air operations meant blimps, non-rigid airships filled with helium, used primarily for coastal patrol and anti-submarine surveillance. They were slow, unarmed, except for depth charges, and vulnerable to weather. But they could remain airborne for extended periods, fly low enough to spot periscopes and oil slicks, and cover vast stretches of ocean that patrol aircraft would miss. The training was methodical. Ground school covered aeronautics, meteorology, navigation, and the specific physics of buoyancy and ballast. Flight training began with supervised ascents, progressed to pattern work, and eventually advanced to cross-country navigation and simulated patrol missions. Cody's flight log from this period shows the same characteristics as his earlier written work. Entries are uniform. Handwriting is precise. Observations are factual. He logged weather conditions, flight duration, maneuvers practiced, and any irregularities encountered. He did not editorialize. When flights went well, he noted satisfactory performance. When they did not, he documented the specific problem and the corrective action taken. By early 1942, Cody had accumulated significant experience. His logbook showed 756 hours of lighter-than-air flight time, a substantial total that placed him well beyond novice status. He had flown in various weather conditions, practiced emergency procedures, and demonstrated proficiency in both piloting and navigation. His instructor's evaluations consistently emphasized his caution. One noted Lieutenant Cody shows appropriate concern for mechanical redundancy and pre-flight inspection. Another observed, he is more worried about equipment failure than enemy action, which is appropriate for this type of operation. That last comment is important. Lighter-than-air operations in 1942 were not combat missions in the conventional sense. Enemy fighters rarely engaged blimps. The real dangers were mechanical failure, weather, and operational error. Cody understood this. His fear was specific and rational. He also found satisfaction in the work, though he expressed it characteristically. Letters home mentioned good flying weather, smooth operations, and visibility excellent for observation. These were not descriptions of excitement. They were acknowledgments that systems were functioning as designed. The pleasure lay in predictability. By summer 1942, Ernest Dewitt Cody had constructed a life with clear boundaries and defined expectations. He was 27 years old. He held the rank of lieutenant. He was married to a woman he wrote to every week. He had accumulated substantial flight experience, in a specialization the Navy needed. He owned few personal items, his officer's watch, his flight log, a small collection of letters from Helen, and the uniform items required by regulation. He was not a collector or a sentimentalist. He kept what served a function and discarded what did not. His daily routine aboard Treasure Island Naval Air Station followed patterns established over years. Wake at 5:30 breakfast, pre-flight briefing equipment, inspection mission execution, post-flight debriefing, dinner, correspondence, sleep. The routine varied only when operational requirements demanded it. He had concrete post-war plans. Letters to Helen mentioned continuing in the Navy, possibly pursuing a permanent commission if the service would have him. He did not discuss civilian employment. He did not express doubts about his career choice. The Navy had become his profession, and he intended to practice it. His ordinary joys were correspondingly modest. He appreciated calm weather. He valued well-maintained equipment. He took satisfaction in completing missions without incident. These were not the pleasures of a romantic or an adventurer. They were the pleasures of a craftsman who trusted his tools and his training. On the evening of August 15, 1942, Cody prepared for a routine patrol scheduled for the following morning. He reviewed weather reports, checked the flight roster, and confirmed that his co-pilot would be Ensign Charles E. Adams, a pairing that had worked well on previous flights. Nothing in his behavior that evening suggested concern. He ate dinner. He wrote a brief letter to Helen, mentioning the next day's patrol in routine terms. He slept normally. There was no premonition, no sense of ending. Just preparation for another day of work that would be, he assumed, like all the days before it. He was wrong. Charles Ellis Adams represented everything Ernest Cody was not, and together they formed an effective crew. Adams was 38 years old in August 1942, 11 years older than Cody. Where Cody had entered the Navy through the academy, Adams had come up through the enlisted ranks over 20 years of service. He was what the Navy called a Mustang, an officer who had worn enlisted stripes long enough to understand the service from the bottom up. Adams' service record with lighter-than-air operations stretched back to the early 1920s, when the Navy's blimp program was still experimental. He had logged thousands of hours in airships of various types. He had served aboard the USS Patoka, the Navy's only airship tender. He had seen the service evolve, from primitive coastal surveillance to systematic anti-submarine patrol. His experience included tragedy. On May 6, 1937, Adams was stationed at Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, when the German passenger airship Hindenburg arrived from Europe. As the massive ship attempted to moor, it caught fire. The hydrogen-filled envelope erupted in flames. The airship crashed in less than a minute. Adams ran toward the wreckage. While others evacuated or stood frozen, he moved into the burning debris and pulled passengers clear. He made multiple trips into areas where metal framework was still collapsing and fabric was still burning. By the time the fire consumed itself, Adams had helped rescue several people who would not have survived otherwise. The German government later awarded him a medal for his actions. The citation translated from German, commended his extraordinary bravery in rescuing passengers and crew under conditions of extreme danger. Adams kept the medal but rarely mentioned it. When asked about the Hindenburg years later, he would only say that he had done what anyone would do. This background mattered. Adams was not a man who panicked. He had seen the worst lighter-than-air catastrophe in history and had responded with clarity and courage. If something went wrong aboard the L-8, he would not freeze. Adams had only received his commission as ensign on August 15, 1942, the day before the final patrol. After 20 years of enlisted service, he had finally been promoted to officer rank. August 16th would be his first flight as a commissioned officer rather than a chief petty officer. The promotion did not change his duties. He remained Cody's co-pilot and would occupy the right seat in the gondola, but it represented recognition of his expertise and experience. His family later said he had been proud of the promotion, though he expressed it simply took long enough. Cody and Adams had flown together multiple times before August 16th. The crew rotation logs show their names paired on at least 7 previous patrols over the preceding 2 months. This was not accidental. Effective crews were kept together when possible. Their partnership worked because their strengths complemented each other. Cody brought academy training, current technical knowledge, and systematic adherence to written procedures. Adams brought 2 decades of practical experience, intuitive understanding of blimp behavior, and the calm that comes from having survived genuine emergency. Crew members who flew with both men described a consistent pattern. Cody handled radio communication, navigation, and mission documentation. Adams managed aircraft systems, monitored weather changes, and made operational recommendations based on experience. They did not need to discuss these divisions. They had evolved naturally over multiple flights. One mechanic who serviced the L-8 recalled overhearing their pre-flight conversations. Cody would go through the checklist item by item. Adams would confirm each one, but sometimes he'd add something. Wind supposed to shift northwest around 1000, might get bumpy near the Farallones. Practical stuff. They worked well together. There is no record of disagreement between them. No evidence of personality conflict. Their partnership was professional rather than personal. They did not socialize off duty, but it was effective. They trusted each other's competence. This background makes the disappearance more difficult to explain. These were not inexperienced aviators making rookie mistakes. These were not men who would take unnecessary risks. One had academy training and 756 logged hours. The other had 20 years with blimps and had literally pulled people from burning wreckage. If both of them failed to transmit a distress call, if both of them vanished without leaving evidence of struggle or panic, then the failure occurred in a way that defeated even extensive experience and proven courage. Treasure Island Naval Air Station sat in San Francisco Bay, between the city and Oakland. Purpose-built for the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition, it had been converted to military use after Pearl Harbor. By summer 1942, it served as headquarters for Patrol Squadron 32, the Navy's West Coast lighter-than-air unit. The morning of August 16th began typically. Weather reports showed scattered fog along the coast, but clearing expected by 0800. Winds were moderate out of the northwest at 8 to 12 knots. Visibility was projected at 3 to 5 miles, adequate for visual patrol. Sea state was calm to moderate. Conditions were well within safe operating parameters for lighter-than-air operations. Cody and Adams arrived for pre-flight briefing at 0530. The mission was standard: depart Treasure Island, fly west to the Farallon Islands, approximately 28 miles offshore, conduct surveillance for submarine activity, then patrol south along the coast before returning to base. Total flight time estimated at 6 to 7 hours. Fuel load sufficient for 9 hours with reserve. The L-8 itself was a K-class blimp, a non-rigid airship, approximately 250 feet long, with a helium capacity of 456,000 cubic feet. It could carry a crew of 10, though patrol missions typically used only 2 pilots, and sometimes a radio man. The gondola suspended beneath the envelope contained the control station, 2 engines, fuel tanks, and minimal crew accommodations. The blimp was equipped with radio-magnetic compass altimeter and basic flight instruments. Armament consisted of depth charges that could be released if a submarine was positively identified. The mission was surveillance, not combat. The L-8 was there to observe and report, not to engage. Pre-flight inspection followed standard checklist envelope: pressure check, control surface movement, engine function test, radio communication, verification fuel, quantity confirmation, life jacket inventory. Cody signed off on the inspection at 05:53. Adams countersigned. At 06:03, the L-8 lifted from its mooring and climbed away from Treasure Island. Several people observed the departure. The blimp appeared normal. Weather conditions were as forecast. Nothing suggested this would be anything other than another routine patrol. The flight west toward the Farallones was uneventful. Cody maintained radio contact with shore stations, providing position reports at prescribed intervals. The transmissions were routine, using standard phrasing and procedures. At 07:38, Cody radioed position 4 miles east of southeast Farallon Island. Continuing patrol route. Weather clear. Visibility, 5 miles. The transmission was calm and procedural. It contained no hint of concern. At 07:42, 4 minutes later, Cody transmitted again. Investigating suspicious oil slick standby. This was the last communication received from the L-8. Several people observed the L-8's final known maneuvers, and their accounts are consistent. Fishermen aboard the vessel Daisy Gray were working approximately 5 miles west of the Farallones when they noticed the blimp descending toward them. The skipper, later interviewed by Navy investigators, described the approach. She came down low, real low. I'd say 30, maybe 40 feet above the water. Slow, like they were looking at something. They dropped a couple smoke markers. We thought maybe they'd spotted a sub and were about to drop charges, so we pulled our nets and moved off. Another fisherman confirmed, I saw 2 men in the gondola, both up front, both looking down at the water. The door was open. I figured they were trying to get a better look at whatever they'd seen. A third witness, operating a small patrol craft in the area, provided similar testimony. The blimp descended to very low altitude, released marker flares, and appeared to be investigating something on the surface. Then it suddenly gained altitude rapidly and entered cloud cover. That last detail, the sudden ascent, was corroborated by multiple witnesses. The L-8 did not climb gradually. It shot upward quickly, disappearing into low clouds within seconds. After that, no one saw Cody or Adams again. For the next 3.5 hours, the L-8 drifted east-northeast with the prevailing wind. It made no radio transmissions. It did not respond to calls from shore stations. It moved silently across the ocean surface toward the California coast. At approximately 10:50, the blimp crossed the coastline near Fort Funston, south of San Francisco. People on the ground noticed it immediately. A large blimp flying low with engines running, but apparently unmaneuvered. At 11:15, the L-8 descended toward Ocean Beach. It touched down on the sand near Fleischhacker Pool. Several fishermen and beachgoers ran toward it and grabbed mooring lines attempting to secure it. But the blimp was too buoyant. Despite multiple people pulling on the lines, it lifted off again after a few seconds of ground contact. The brief touchdown caused damage. One depth charge mechanism was torn away. The gondola's underside scraped across rocks. The envelope lost some helium through small tears. The blimp then drifted inland, crossing the Great Highway and moving over the Olympia Golf Course. Golfers scattered as the massive envelope passed overhead at an altitude of perhaps 100 feet. It cleared a residential neighborhood, losing altitude gradually. At approximately 11:30, the L-8 descended for the last time onto Bellevue Avenue in Daly City, a residential street lined with modest houses. The gondola struck the pavement. One engine broke loose. Fuel spilled across the asphalt. The envelope collapsed partially, but remained largely intact. Residents called the fire department immediately. Firefighters arrived within minutes, concerned about fire risk from the spilled fuel. They approached the gondola, cautiously, unsure what they would find. When firefighters cut through the gondola's fabric covering to access the interior, they encountered a scene that was both ordinary and inexplicable. The control station appeared normal. Switches were in positions consistent with steady flight rather than emergency shutdown. The throttles were set for moderate cruise power. The radio was on, tuned to the correct frequency, and fully functional. The magnetic compass showed a heading consistent with the blimp's final drift direction. Both seats were empty. The safety belts for both positions were present and undamaged. They were simply unbuckled, unfastened normally, not torn or cut. This detail suggested that whoever had been sitting there had released the belts deliberately, rather than being thrown from the seat by violent maneuver. The gondola door was open. More specifically, it was latched in the open position using the standard door latch. This was not damage from impact. Someone had opened the door intentionally and secured it to remain open. Of the 3 required life jackets, 2 were missing. Navy regulations required all crew members to wear life jackets when flying over water, and pre-flight inspection had confirmed 3 jackets aboard. Now only 1 remained. Cody's service cap sat on the instrument panel near the pilot's seat. His officer's cap, with its distinctive naval insignia, placed where he might have set it down temporarily while performing some task. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of fire or explosion. No evidence that anyone had been injured inside the gondola. The mechanical inspection that followed found the aircraft fundamentally sound. Both engines were operational. The fuel system was intact. The control surfaces responded normally. There was no catastrophic failure that would have forced emergency evacuation. The only significant damage was from the multiple impacts during the uncontrolled landing sequence damage that occurred after the crew was already gone. The Navy investigators who examined the L-8 on Bellevue Avenue faced a situation without clear precedent. The aircraft had returned. The crew had not. The physical evidence suggested deliberate action, the open door, the unfastened belts, the missing life jackets, but provided no explanation for why those actions had been taken. The most immediate question was the missing Mayday call. Naval aviators were trained to communicate distress whenever physically possible. Even in rapid emergency, even during a crash, you attempted to transmit position and nature of emergency. It was drilled into every pilot from the first day of flight training. Cody had sent nothing after his routine report about investigating the oil slick. Adams, with 20 years of experience, had sent nothing. The radio was functional. The frequency was correct. They had time to unfasten seatbelts, open a door, and apparently exit the aircraft, but no time to key the microphone and say Mayday. The open door presented similar questions. The door could be opened in flight for various legitimate reasons. Better visibility during low-altitude surveillance deployment of equipment, inspection of external components. But it was supposed to be secured afterward. Leaving it latched open during flight was irregular. The missing life jackets suggested the crew had taken them, presumably wearing them when they exited. But exited, how jumped deliberately, fell accidentally. The gondola was approximately 30 to 40 feet above water when last observed by witnesses. Jumping from that height into the ocean would be dangerous, but survivable with a life jacket. But why would 2 experienced aviators abandon a functioning aircraft? And if they had abandoned it, why was there no distress call? And if they had jumped with life jackets, why had search operations found no trace of them? The Navy's response followed doctrine. An overdue aircraft triggered protocols designed to maximize probability of recovery while available time and resources permitted action. Within 30 minutes of the L-8 being reported overdue, at 0900 search coordination began. The operations center at Treasure Island immediately attempted radio contact on all frequencies. When that produced no response, they implemented the graduated search sequence. First phase notification. All Navy vessels within 50 miles of the projected patrol route were alerted. Coast Guard stations received bulletins. Shore-based lookouts were directed to maintain watch for a blimp matching the L-8's description. Second phase aerial search. Available patrol aircraft were diverted to retrace the L-8's known route. Fixed-wing aircraft could cover large areas quickly. They flew expanding square patterns centered on the last reported position 4 miles east of the Farallones. Third phase surface search. Coast Guard cutters and Navy patrol craft moved toward the search area. Fishing vessels in the vicinity were contacted by radio and asked to report anything unusual. The search pattern assumed equipment failure or emergency descent. The operating theory during the first hours was that the blimp had experienced mechanical problems and attempted a water landing. If the crew had ditched successfully, they should be afloat in life jackets, possibly with a deployed life raft awaiting rescue. But the search found nothing. No distress calls were received. No flares were observed. No dye markers appeared on the water surface. No debris field was located. The oil slick that Cody had been investigating could not be definitively relocated. Several vessels reported oil on the surface, but chemical analysis would later show these were natural seepage common in that area. By 1100, the search had expanded to cover over 200 square miles of ocean. Weather conditions remained favorable for visual observation. Visibility was good. Sea state was calm enough that floating objects would be easily spotted. Still, nothing. When reports came in around 11:30 that the L-8 had landed in Daly City, search coordinators initially felt relief. If the aircraft had returned, the crew should be with it. That relief lasted approximately 20 minutes until the first responders reported the gondola was empty. The confusion this created was profound. The Navy had procedures for crashes, for mechanical failures, for combat losses. It had no procedure for an aircraft that returned without its crew. The immediate concern was whether the men might still be in the area. Perhaps they had landed, exited the blimp for some reason, and become separated during the subsequent uncontrolled drift. Search teams fanned out across Daly City and surrounding areas, checking streets, interviewing residents, searching vacant lots and beaches. They found nothing. No one had seen two Navy officers in flight suits walking the streets. No one had observed anyone exiting the blimp during its final descent. Meanwhile, technical teams descended on the L-8 itself. If mechanical failure had forced the crew to evacuate, evidence should exist. They inspected every system methodically. Engines both operational, no evidence of fire or catastrophic failure. Fuel system intact, no leaks in fuel lines or tanks. Electrical, functional, no shorts or burned wiring. Control surfaces, responsive cables, undamaged. Envelope, some tears from impact, but no catastrophic rupture or rapid deflation. The radio received particular attention. It was tested extensively. It transmitted and received normally. The frequency settings were correct. The volume was turned up. If someone had been trying to call the L-8, they would have heard it. The life jacket inventory was rechecked. Pre-flight inspection had confirmed 3 jackets. 1 remained. 2 were missing. Unless the jackets had somehow fallen out during flight. Unlikely given their storage location, the crew had taken them. Navy investigators immediately began interviewing everyone who had observed the L-8 that morning. The fisherman from the Daisy Gray provided the most detailed account. Captain Frank Morelli, age 47, skipper of the Daisy Gray. We were fishing about 5 miles west-northwest of the Farallones. Good fishing that morning. We'd had nets down maybe 40 minutes. I saw the blimp coming from the east descending. I thought at first they were just doing their patrol, but then they came down real low. Lower than I'd ever seen one fly. Maybe 30 feet off the water, close enough I could see the pilots clearly. 2 men, both in the front of the gondola. They were looking down, seemed like they were studying something in the water, real careful. They dropped a couple of smoke floats. That's when I got worried. You drop smoke, floats, to mark a position, usually a submarine contact. I'd heard about blimps dropping depth charges, and I sure didn't want to be anywhere near that. I ordered nets, pulled in, and we started moving away. That's when it got strange. The blimp just shot up. Not a normal climb. I mean, it went up fast, like it wasn't under control. Just rose straight up into the clouds and disappeared. I figured maybe they'd spotted a sub and were climbing to get away from return fire or something. We kept moving off just to be safe. We didn't see it again after that. But I'll tell you what bothered me. If they'd spotted a sub, they would have dropped charges. They had time. They marked the position. But they didn't drop anything except the smoke. That didn't make sense to me. Angelo Rossi, fisherman aboard the Daisy Gray. I got a good look at the 2 men in the front. The door on the side was open. I figured they opened it to see better, to look at whatever they were investigating. Both guys were leaning forward, looking down. Then the blimp just took off upward real fast. I don't think they were controlling that climb. It looked wrong too fast. John Nielsen, Coast Guard officer, aboard patrol craft CG-407. We were approximately 3 miles northeast of the L-8's last reported position when we observed it descending to low altitude. From our distance, perhaps a mile and a half, we could see it drop to very low altitude and hover for maybe 2-3 minutes. We saw the smoke markers deploy. Then the aircraft gained altitude rapidly and entered cloud layer. We attempted radio contact, but received no response. The rapid altitude gain seemed unusual. Our coxswain, who has experience with blimps, remarked that it looked like the blimp had lost ballast suddenly. When a blimp loses weight, it rises fast because the helium lift is suddenly greater than the total weight. But we had no explanation for why it would lose weight like that. These interviews provided a timeline, but not an explanation. Multiple witnesses confirmed the L-8 descended to very low altitude deployed markers, and then rose rapidly into clouds. All of this occurred over approximately 3 to 5 minutes. After that, the blimp was not seen again, until it appeared over San Francisco more than 3 hours later. As evening approached on August 16th, the search expanded to its maximum extent. Every available Navy and Coast Guard asset within range was committed. Air Search Patrol aircraft flew grid patterns, covering over 800 square miles from the Farallones east to the Golden Gate, north to Point Reyes, and south past Half Moon Bay. Surface search. 14 vessels systematically covered the most probable drift areas, accounting for wind and current during the time frame between 0742 and 1130. Shore search Coast Guard teams walked beaches from Fort Funston south to Pacifica, searching for any evidence that might have washed ashore. The search was thorough and well coordinated. Weather remained favorable. Visibility was good. Seas were calm. If there was anything to find, conditions were optimal for finding it. The search found nothing. No bodies. No life jackets. No pieces of equipment. No debris that could be definitively linked to the L-8 or its crew. The ocean surface yielded no evidence that 2 men in life jackets had entered the water. This absence of evidence was perhaps more troubling than wreckage would have been. Wreckage would have suggested accident or mechanical failure. Absence suggested something else, something outside the normal categories of aviation mishap. As darkness fell on August 16th, search operations continued under floodlights where possible, but effectiveness decreased dramatically. The search coordinator made the difficult decision to suspend active searching until dawn while maintaining radio watch, in case either crew member was able to transmit. That first night was particularly difficult for those who knew Cody and Adams. Fellow pilots at Treasure Island assembled in the operations center, monitoring radio frequencies, hoping for a transmission. None came. Helen Cody received official notification at approximately 1800 hours. A Navy chaplain and a personnel officer appeared at her quarters to inform her that her husband's aircraft had returned, but that Lieutenant Cody was missing. The notification was careful and procedural. They did not say he was dead. They said he was missing, and that search operations were ongoing. Helen's immediate response, according to the personnel officer's report, was a single question: was there an accident? The officer replied honestly, "We don't know, ma'am. The aircraft appears undamaged. We don't know what happened." She asked when they would know. The officer could not answer. The investigation that followed over the next weeks encountered a fundamental problem. The technology of 1942 could not reconstruct events that left no physical trace. Modern aircraft carry flight data recorders that continuously log altitude, airspeed, heading control inputs, engine parameters, and radio transmissions. Even small aircraft today have GPS tracking that provides minute-by-minute position data. Crash investigators can often reconstruct an accident's final minutes with remarkable precision. The L-8 had none of this. Its instruments were mechanical and left no permanent record. There was no automatic position tracking. Radio transmissions were not recorded, except when a shore station operator happened to write them down. The blimp's path between 0742 and 1050 could only be estimated based on wind data and the known endpoints. The investigators could establish what did not happen: no catastrophic structural failure, no fire, no explosion, no combat damage. But they could not establish what did happen. The gap between the last radio transmission and the empty gondola could not be filled with hard evidence. This created an investigative dead end. Without physical evidence, without witnesses to the critical moments, without recorded data, the Navy could document the outcome, but not the cause. By August 20th, 4 days after the disappearance, the active search was formally concluded. This decision was not made lightly. It was made because probability of recovering the crew alive had diminished to near zero, and continuing to commit resources produced no new information. The search had covered over 1,500 square miles of ocean. Dozens of aircraft had flown hundreds of hours. Ships had steamed thousands of miles in search patterns. Shore teams had walked miles of coastline. Every reported sighting had been investigated. Every piece of floating debris had been checked. Nothing connected to Cody or Adams had been found. The L-8 itself was inspected a final time, then returned to service after repairs. The Navy needed every available blimp for coastal patrol. Keeping the L-8 grounded as evidence served no purpose when the evidence had yielded no answers. The case file remained open, but it entered a different category: missing status, unknown search, suspended, pending new information. For the Navy, this was administratively necessary. Resources had to be allocated to ongoing operations. The war continued. Other patrols needed to be flown. Other crews needed to be protected. For Ernest Cody's family, the suspension of the search marked the beginning of something much harder than the immediate crisis, the long wait for answers that would never come. 5 days after Ernest vanished, Helen Cody received her first official correspondence from the Bureau of Naval Personnel. The letter was dated August 21, 1942. It was typed on official Navy letterhead signed by a personnel officer, whose name Helen would come to know well over the following year. The letter was brief and carefully worded. Dear Mrs. Cody, this is to confirm that your husband, Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody, USN, is currently carried on Navy rolls as missing. Extensive search operations were conducted in the area of his last known position. These operations have been suspended, but the case remains under active review. You will be notified immediately of any new information. In the meantime, pay and allowances will continue in accordance with regulations governing personnel in missing status. The Navy extends its deepest sympathy during this difficult time. The letter was professional and procedurally correct. It acknowledged uncertainty without offering false hope. It made no promises about outcome. What the letter could not contain, was any explanation of what had happened, because the Navy did not know. Helen read the letter multiple times that first day. She focused on specific phrases: missing, not dead; active review suggesting ongoing effort; any new information implying that information might come. She filed the letter carefully in a folder that would eventually hold dozens more just like it. Over the following weeks and months, a pattern established itself. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another letter would arrive from the Bureau of Naval Personnel. The letters varied only in date. The content was nearly identical. Dear Mrs. Cody, this is to inform you that the status of your husband, Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody, USN, remains unchanged. He continues to be carried as missing. No additional information has been received. You will be notified immediately should circumstances change. September brought 3 such letters. October brought 2. November brought 3 more. Each one acknowledged that nothing had changed, that no new information existed, that the status remained exactly as it had been. Helen came to dread the sight of the official envelope. Not because it might contain bad news, she already had the worst news possible, but because it contained no news at all. Each letter was a reminder that time was passing and nothing was being resolved. She continued living in the quarters assigned to officers' families, but the space felt wrong. Other wives had husbands who came home in the evenings. She had letters that confirmed her husband was neither confirmed dead nor confirmed alive. The ambiguity affected every aspect of daily life. When acquaintances asked how her husband was doing, what could she say? He's missing, he's presumed alive but not confirmed. The truth was too complicated for casual conversation, so she began avoiding social situations entirely. The designation missing created administrative complications that civilian life is not designed to handle. Pay and allowances continued as the Navy had promised, but they were temporary. Regulations specified that if a service member remained missing without resolution for more than 1 year, status would be reviewed and benefits would be adjusted. Helen lived with the knowledge that financial support had an expiration date. Insurance policies were ambiguous. Life insurance required proof of death to pay out. Without a body, without a death certificate, policies remained in limbo. Helen contacted the insurance company in October to inquire about the status. The company representative was sympathetic but clear. Until the Navy issued a determination of death, the policy could not be settled. She could not fully grieve because the loss was not confirmed. She could not fully move forward because the status remained unresolved. She existed in a space between 2 states belonging fully to neither. Helen's mother, Matilda Turner Haddock, came to stay with her daughter in September. Matilda had lost her own father in the First World War, a death confirmed by telegram and later by the return of remains. She understood loss, but this was different. At least we knew, Matilda said once. It was terrible, but we knew. We could bury him. We could say goodbye. This not knowing, this is harder. Helen's father, Leander, wrote weekly letters from Pennsylvania. He offered practical advice about financial matters, legal issues dealing with Navy bureaucracy. His letters were helpful and well-intentioned, but they could not address the central problem. There was nothing to be done, no action to take, no decision to make, only waiting. Helen's uncle, Rear Admiral Ira Haddock, used his connections to make inquiries through Navy channels. He spoke with officers who had participated in the search. He reviewed the investigative reports. He came away with the same conclusion the official inquiry had reached. No one knew what had happened. Admiral Haddock wrote to Helen in November, with characteristic honesty, "I have made every inquiry that my position allows. I have reviewed all available documentation. I must tell you that the Navy genuinely does not know what occurred. This is not evasion or concealment. It is simply the limit of what can be determined from available evidence. I wish I could give you better answers. I cannot." That letter in some ways was harder to read than the routine status updates. It confirmed that even family connections and insider access could not penetrate the fundamental mystery. As summer 1943 approached, Helen understood that the arbitrary designation of 1 year carried administrative weight. Navy regulations required periodic review of missing status, with presumptive determinations made after reasonable time had elapsed. She received notification in July 1943 that Ernest's status would be formally reviewed in August, 1 year after his disappearance. The letter explained that in the absence of new evidence, or reasonable probability of recovery, the designation would likely change from missing to presumed dead. The letter asked if she had any new information to provide. She did not. It asked if she wished to submit a statement for consideration. She could not think of what to say that would matter. On August 17, 1943, 1 year and 1 day after Ernest vanished, the official determination was issued. Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody was hereby presumed dead with official date of death listed as August 16, 1942. The letter conveying this determination was longer than previous correspondence. It acknowledged the difficulty of the decision expressed, the Navy's continued sympathy, and explained the procedural necessity of the designation. It noted that presumption of death was not a factual determination, but an administrative requirement. It also outlined what would change pay and allowances would cease. As of the date of determination, death benefits would be processed, and final settlement of accounts would proceed. For Helen, the designation changed everything and nothing. Everything. She was now officially a widow. She could begin processing insurance claims. She could make decisions about her future without bureaucratic ambiguity. Nothing. She still did not know what had happened to her husband. She still had no body to bury. She still had no answers to give when people asked how he died. Psychologists who later studied the effects of ambiguous loss, loss without confirmation, without closure, without remains identified specific patterns of prolonged grief. Helen Cody's experience matched those patterns precisely. She reported difficulty accepting the finality of death. Part of her understood intellectually that Ernest was gone. Another part kept expecting him to walk through the door, to send a letter explaining some bizarre misunderstanding, to appear with an explanation for the missing year. She experienced what clinicians call frozen grief, an inability to fully mourn because the loss felt incomplete. Traditional mourning rituals assume a definite endpoint, a funeral, a burial, a gravestone. Helen had none of these. She struggled with intrusive thoughts. What had happened in those final moments? Had he suffered? Had he been afraid? Had he thought of her? These questions had no answers, but they cycled through her mind repeatedly. She felt guilty about moving forward. In 1945, 2 years after Ernest was declared dead, Helen began seeing Edgar Bertram Delamater, a civilian she met through family friends. Edgar was kind, patient, and understanding about her situation. They married in April 1945. The marriage was practical and companionate rather than passionate. Edgar provided stability and partnership. Helen appreciated both, but she felt irrationally that remarrying was somehow a betrayal, even though Ernest had been declared dead, even though moving forward was reasonable. In 1947, 5 years after Ernest's disappearance, Helen wrote to the Bureau of Naval Personnel with a report that revealed the depth of her unresolved grief. "Gentlemen, I am writing to report that my mother, Mrs. Matilda Haddock, believes she saw my late husband, Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody, on a street in Philadelphia in March of this year. She states that he appeared confused or dazed and did not respond when she called to him. She lost sight of him in a crowd before she could approach. I am reporting this not because I necessarily believe my husband is alive, but because I felt obligated to pass along my mother's statement. I should note that this sighting has caused considerable distress in my current household. I have a child by my present marriage, and the uncertainty this has created is painful. However, I felt I should report it for whatever action you deem appropriate. The Navy's response was sympathetic, but clear. There was no evidence to support reopening the case. The sighting was almost certainly mistaken identity, compounded by wishful thinking. But the letter is revealing for what it shows about Helen's state of mind 5 years after loss. She felt obligated to report even an improbable sighting. She still harbored some microscopic hope that Ernest might somehow be alive. She was still caught between the need to move forward and the inability to fully let go. Helen lived until 1991, 49 years after Ernest disappeared. She raised a daughter, Karen, with Edgar Delamater. She built a new life. She had moments of happiness and satisfaction. But those who knew her said she never fully resolved the loss of Ernest. She kept his Naval Academy class ring, his final letter to her, and his official portrait in a box that moved with her through multiple residences. She did not display these items, but she did not discard them either. Her daughter Karen later recalled asking her mother about her first husband when Karen was in her teens. Helen's answer was telling. He was a good man who disappeared. I never found out what happened to him. That's harder than you might think. The absence of explanation created a wound that never fully healed. It was not dramatic or incapacitating. It was simply there, a permanent feature of Helen's internal landscape, a question that could not be answered, a goodbye that was never said. When Helen died in 1991, her obituary mentioned both of her marriages. It noted that she was predeceased by her first husband, Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt. Cody USN lost in 1942. The word lost was accurate, not killed, not deceased, lost. Because that was what had happened, and it was all anyone could say with certainty. In 1982, 40 years after the disappearance, the Naval History and Heritage Command undertook a comprehensive review of lighter-than-air operations during World War II. The project was academic rather than investigative. A historical documentation effort, not an attempt to solve old cases. Dr. Richard K. Smith, a naval historian specializing in aviation, was assigned to review LTA operations from 1942. The L-8 incident appeared repeatedly in operational summaries, always with the notation cause undetermined. Smith requested the complete case file from Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. The file arrived in 3 boxes: investigation reports, search records, witness statements, and post-loss correspondence. Smith spent 2 weeks reviewing every document. His conclusions, published in a 1984 Naval History article, were carefully worded. The disappearance of Lt. Cody and ENS Adams represents one of the few incidents from lighter-than-air operations during World War II that defies confident explanation. The thoroughness of the contemporary investigation is evident from the documentation. The absence of conclusive findings is not the result of investigative failure, but of evidentiary limitation. Simply put, the event occurred in a manner that defeated available observation and documentation methods. Smith's analysis identified several important points that had been less clear in 1942. First, the rapid ascent observed by witnesses was almost certainly caused by sudden loss of weight. Blimps maintain altitude through a delicate balance between lift from helium and weight from gondola fuel crew equipment. If approximately 160 kilograms, the combined weight of 2 men suddenly left the aircraft, the blimp would immediately become too buoyant and rise rapidly. The physics were straightforward. This explained the witness's observation that the L-8 shot upward rather than climbing gradually. It did not explain why the men left the aircraft. Second, the open and latched door strongly suggested deliberate action rather than accident. Latching a door open requires conscious effort. It is not something that happens accidentally during a crash or emergency. Third, the missing life jackets indicated the crew had taken them presumably to wear. This suggested they anticipated entering the water either through planned action or recognized emergency. Fourth, the absence of a mayday call remained the most puzzling element. Even in extreme emergency, even if both men had to evacuate immediately, someone should have keyed the microphone and said something. A position, a situation report, a single word. The complete radio silence suggested either instantaneous incapacitation or a situation that evolved too quickly for communication. Smith compared the L-8 case to other lighter-than-air incidents from the same period. Several patterns emerged. When blimps experienced mechanical failure, they generally left evidence-damaged components, fire traces, structural failure indicators. The L-8 showed none of these. When blimps encountered severe weather, they either rode it out or crashed with significant envelope damage. The L-8's envelope showed only minor tears from the uncontrolled landing. When crews abandoned aircraft intentionally, they typically transmitted distress calls first and left evidence of emergency preparation. The L-8 showed neither. The case did not fit established patterns. It occupied a unique position in the historical record. After reviewing all available evidence, Smith concluded that the most likely explanation, though not provable, was accidental fall during low-altitude investigation. His reasoning, the L-8, descended to approximately 30 feet above water to investigate the oil slick. The crew opened the gondola door for better visibility, latching it open to keep it from swinging. At that altitude, in an open gondola, one crew member may have leaned out too far or lost balance during a sudden wind gust or minor turbulence. Falling from 30 feet into the ocean even with a life jacket is serious. The impact would cause injury. The cold water Pacific Ocean in that area is typically 52 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit in August, would cause rapid incapacitation. The second crew member, seeing his partner fall, may have immediately attempted rescue, grabbing his life jacket, and exiting the aircraft to help, perhaps without time to transmit because the emergency was immediate and the rescue impulse overwhelming. Or the first man's fall may have destabilized the blimp, causing it to pitch or roll suddenly, throwing the second man out as well. The moment both men left the gondola, the blimp would have become violently buoyant and risen rapidly, exactly what witnesses observed. The men in the water with life jackets would have been difficult to spot from distance. Ocean currents in that area run south-southwest at approximately 0.5 to 1.5 knots. They would have drifted away from the marked position quickly. Cold water incapacitation would have occurred within 30 to 45 minutes, even with life jackets. The search, though extensive, may simply have missed them in the vast area affected by current drift. This explanation fits all known facts. It requires no extraordinary circumstances, no enemy action, no equipment failure beyond normal risk factors. But it cannot be proven. It remains hypothesis. Smith's analysis was scrupulously honest about the limits of available evidence. We cannot determine with certainty what happened in the final minutes before the crew separated from the aircraft. We can describe what probably occurred based on physics and operational probability. We cannot describe what definitely occurred because no observer witnessed it and no physical evidence documents it. This distinction matters. Historical analysis requires intellectual honesty about what can and cannot be known. The disappearance of Lt. Cody and ENS Adams occurred in a manner that exceeds our ability to reconstruct with confidence. That is not a failure of investigation then or now. It is simply the nature of this particular incident. Smith's article generated modest interest in naval history circles. Several retired lighter-than-air veterans wrote to him with their own theories, but none provided new evidence. One letter came from a former blimp pilot who had flown with Charles Adams in the 1930s. I read your article about the L-8 with great interest. I knew Charlie Adams personally. He was as steady as they come, not the type to panic, not the type to take foolish risks. If he went over the side, it was either to help someone else or because circumstances gave him no choice. That's the only explanation consistent with the man I knew. Another letter came from a meteorologist who had studied wind patterns in the Farallon area. Your analysis of the likely cause seems sound. I would add that winds in that area can be treacherous. Localized gusts, sudden direction changes, wind shear, at low altitude, where the marine layer interacts with land effect winds. A blimp at 30 feet would be vulnerable to sudden lateral force that could destabilize crew members in an open gondola. These responses added color, but not evidence. The case remained where it had always been probable, but not provable. Smith's work did not reopen the case in any official sense. The Navy did not resume searching. No new investigation was launched. The status of Cody and Adams remained unchanged. What Smith did accomplish was important in a different way. He established with historical rigor that the case was genuinely unresolved rather than covered up or neglected. He demonstrated that the contemporary investigation had been thorough and professional. He showed that the absence of answers reflected evidentiary limits rather than investigative failure. This mattered for historical integrity. It prevented the case from becoming fodder for conspiracy theories. It honored the memory of the investigators who had worked the case in 1942 by showing they had done everything possible with available tools. Most importantly, it established the truth. Ernest, Dewitt, Cody, and Charles E. Adams had disappeared during routine duty, and despite everyone's best efforts, no one could say exactly what had happened in those final minutes. That acknowledgement of limit, of the boundary between what could be known and what could not, was the closest thing to closure the historical record would ever provide. There was no identification. There was no recovery. This must be stated clearly, because it defines the final chapter more accurately than any ceremony or ritual. In cases where remains are eventually found, sometimes decades after loss, modern forensic science can work backward toward identity. DNA analysis, dental records, personal effects, even isotope analysis can connect fragmented remains to names in missing persons files. The ocean has returned remains from World War II incidents in recent years. Bodies from aircraft that crashed at sea in the 1940s have washed ashore in the 2000s, preserved by cold water and deep currents. Forensic teams have identified them and returned them to families who had waited 70 years. This did not happen for Ernest, Cody, or Charles Adams. The Pacific Ocean, which receives over 70% of the world's water volume from countless sources, did not yield their remains, not in the weeks following the disappearance, not in the years after, not in the decades since. There was no material subject for forensic work, no bones recovered from the Farallones, no personal effects found on distant beaches, no wreckage containing biological trace material. The absence was complete. On August 17, 1943, the Navy issued its formal determination. Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody and Ensign Charles E. Adams were presumed dead as of August 16, 1942. The designation presumed dead has specific legal meaning. It does not assert factual death. It asserts administrative necessity. It means sufficient time has elapsed without evidence of survival, and continuing to maintain missing status serves no practical purpose. The determination allowed final processing. Death certificates were issued listing cause as missing in action presumed dead. Death benefits were calculated and paid to next of kin. Service records were closed with final entries. Personal effects were inventoried and released to families. Insurance policies were settled. Military honors were authorized. These actions provided administrative closure. They did not provide explanation. Ernest Dewitt Cody's name is inscribed at Arlington National Cemetery on the Courts of the Missing. The memorial is located in Section 34, a colonnade surrounding a central plaza where names of service members never recovered are carved into marble. The inscription reads, Ernest Dewitt Cody, Lieutenant U.S. Navy, Michigan, August 16, 1942. Nearby, on the same memorial structure, appears Charles E. Adams, Ensign U.S. Navy, Massachusetts, August 16, 1942. The memorial serves a specific function. It provides a physical location for remembrance when no grave exists. It creates space for ritual when no burial is possible. It acknowledges service and loss, even when remains cannot be returned. Helen Cody visited the memorial once, in 1952. Her daughter Karen, then 7 years old, accompanied her. Karen later recalled the visit. Mother stood, looking at the name for a long time. She didn't cry. She just stood there. Then she touched the letters with her fingers very gently, and we left. She never went back. Charles Adams' family visited more regularly. His sister maintained an annual tradition of placing flowers at the memorial on August 16th. She continued this for 40 years until her own death in 1987. The memorial acknowledges loss. It cannot explain it. It provides a place to stand. It cannot answer what happened. It marks service and sacrifice. It cannot restore what was taken. For families seeking closure, that elusive psychological state, where grief is resolved and loss is integrated, a cenotaph is profoundly insufficient. It is better than nothing. It is nowhere close to enough. Helen Cody remarried, had a child, built a new life. But until her death in 1991, she kept Ernest's letters, his class ring, and his photograph in a box that moved with her through 5 different residences. She never displayed these items publicly. She never discarded them. The box represented the space between letting go and holding on the permanent state of ambiguous loss. The Navy's position on the case has remained unchanged since 1943. The disappearance of L.T. Cody and E.N.S. Adams occurred during the performance of duty cause, undetermined remains not recovered. No revision has been made to this determination. No new evidence has prompted reconsideration. The case is complete in administrative terms and incomplete in explanatory terms. The Navy has been approached multiple times over the decades by journalists, historians, and family members asking for additional investigation. The response has been consistent and honest. There is nothing additional to investigate. The evidence that exists has been thoroughly reviewed. The evidence that does not exist cannot be conjured. In 2007, during a general review of World War II casualties, the L-8 case was examined one final time by the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency. The agency concluded, based on comprehensive review of all available records, there is no credible evidence suggesting remains of Lt. Cody or ENS Adams are recoverable. The case does not meet criteria for active investigation. Status remains unrecovered, presumed dead. This determination closed the final administrative door. There would be no excavation because there was no site. There would be no recovery because there were no remains. There would be no identification because there was nothing to identify. What did the delay cost? For Helen Cody, 13 months of administrative limbo, followed by 48 years of unresolved questions. A life built atop a foundation, containing a permanent absence. For Ernest, Cody's mother Dora, who lived until 1973, 31 years of not knowing exactly what happened to her son. She received the folded flag. She accepted the condolences. She lived with the gap between those rituals and the understanding they were supposed to provide. For Charles Adams' family, the same span of uncertainty, the same inadequate substitutes for actual remains, the same permanent incompleteness. For the broader institution, a demonstration of the limits of responsibility. The Navy did everything within its capacity in 1942. It searched extensively. It investigated thoroughly. It documented carefully. When evidence ended, so did its ability to provide answers. The system reached its boundary. The delay between loss and designation 1 year was procedurally required and psychologically devastating. But it was not the real delay. The real delay was the 8 decades between disappearance and the present, during which time no additional information emerged. That delay did not result from negligence or concealment. It resulted from the fundamental nature of the event. 2 men vanished in a way that defeated observation, left no recoverable trace, and occurred in an environment that yielded nothing back. The cost of that delay was carried privately by individuals whose names appear in no memorials, whose grief generated no official documentation, who simply lived with the weight of unresolved loss until they themselves died. Ernest Dewitt Cody did not vanish into mystery. He vanished into a gap that institutional procedures could not close and that time could not resolve. What was restored? His name. Carved in marble at Arlington. Entered in the official roll of naval casualties. Acknowledged in memorial services and historical accounts. What was never restored? Certainty. An account of the final minutes. The ability to say with confidence, this is what happened. The Navy completed its responsibility as defined by regulation: search, investigate, document, designate, commemorate. What it could not do, what no one could do, was explain events that left no witness and no trace. Helen Cody waited 1 year for official designation of death. She waited 49 years for peace that never fully came. The administrative process gave her finality. It could not give her understanding. The case demonstrates something important about institutional limits. They exist, not because of failure or bad faith, but because some events occur at the boundary of what can be captured. The Navy of 1942 could wage war across oceans. It could not reconstruct absence without evidence. Advances in technology since 1942 are extraordinary. Modern aircraft carry recorders that survive crashes. GPS tracks every movement. Satellite systems monitor the entire planet. If the L-8 disappeared today, investigators would have data streams showing altitude, heading position, and control inputs up to the final second. But those tools cannot retroactively generate data that was never recorded. The ocean has kept what it kept. The final minutes remain unknown. They will always remain unknown. The cost of that permanent unknowing was not borne by the institution. It was carried by Helen, who remarried but never forgot. By Dora, who outlived her son by 30 years without ever knowing his final moments. By families who had names carved in marble, but no graves to tend. That cost was measured not in shock or drama, but in duration. In years lived with a question that had no answer. In the weight of ambiguity that could never fully resolve. On August 16, 1942, 2 experienced naval officers performed their duty exactly as trained. They followed procedures. They reported what they observed. They acted within operational parameters. And then they disappeared. Not because they failed. Not because the system failed. But because routine operations accumulate invisible risk. And sometimes, rarely but sometimes, that risk materializes in ways that exceed preparation. Ernest Dewitt Cody's name stands at Arlington. His service is honored. His loss is acknowledged. But the final seconds of his life remain unknown, and recognition of that limit, the boundary between what cannot be known and what was deliberately hidden, is the only honest conclusion available. The delay did not lead to discovery. The delay became permanent. And that permanence, carried across generations, is the true cost of questions that cannot be answered.